As Juan said, we'll be focusing on exam preparation today. We'll be basically talking about some best practices to start thinking about right at the beginning of an exam preparation course. Yeah, the idea is that sort of, if you get off on the right foot, if you sort of put some of these best practices into practice right at the very beginning of the course, they're going to help you and your students reach that ultimate goal of helping them pass their exam. We'll be using examples from the Ready For series today, and I'll be using, most of my examples come specifically from the C1 Advanced book, which has recently been released. And as Juan said, I'm the author of the teacher's books for both the C1 and the B2 levels. And I'm also a teacher. I've been teaching the Ready For series, the 3rd edition, for many years now at my school. And as part of this webinar, I'm sort of sharing some of my personal experience and tips from my personal experience preparing students for these exams. So let's get started. So my first tip has to do with needs analysis. So I'm sure many of you out there are familiar with this term, hopefully most of you. But for anybody that's a little bit less familiar with the idea of needs analysis, the idea of this is that you, at the beginning of a course, you do some activities to get an idea of sort of basically collect information about your students' needs and their preferences, and then sort of analyze that a bit, and then make decisions about your course, the course you're going to teach, based on sort of what you've discovered or uncovered about your students' needs. So now that I've sort of told you what it is, I'm just sort of curious, just to get us started. Is this something that you guys do in your classes at the beginning of an exam preparation course? Do you do this type of needs analysis activity? Do you do it always? Do it sometimes? Never? Just let me know in the chat box. Martha says always. Nadia says sometimes. Paul says always. I'm getting lots of always, lots of sometimes. I got a usually. Okay, so it sounds like many of you are doing this already, and then you, I'm sure, sort of see the benefit of it. For me, I think it's really good to get this type of insight at the beginning of a course, because it really helps me focus on what students really need to improve. And students are generally pretty good at telling you what they need to improve. Students do know themselves as learners. They've had experience with other exams. They've obviously been learning English for a long time, particularly if they're going to be preparing for a C1 advanced exam. And they're able to tell you important things that, like that writing has always been challenging for them, or that they've always found the listening pretty easy. Those are important things to know at the beginning of a course. So in terms of sort of tips for what to think about in terms of gathering information from your students, it's really good to get an idea of their strengths and weaknesses, as I've mentioned. But it's also good to talk about their motivations as well. You might think that the motivation for students in an exam preparation course would be sort of the same for everyone. They all want to pass this C1 advanced exam, but they may have different reasons for wanting to do that. For some people, it might be a personal goal. Other people, there might be a lot riding on it. It may mean that they get into a university program, or they get a promotion at work. And then, sometimes, at least in my context, I have students that aren't actually interested in taking the exam. They're just doing this course because they want to do something challenging, and this is sort of the best course on offer. And they sort of don't mind the extra exam part of the lesson, and they're just there to improve their English. And of course, that's a good thing to know from the beginning of a course as well, that maybe you have some students in the group that actually aren't planning to sit the exam. And lastly, I think that getting a feeling from students' learning preferences can be quite important too. Again, students can tell you some very useful information if you ask for it. For example, I'm a teacher that have sort of high expectations for my students, and I expect them to do writing and reading and things like that outside of class in my courses, as I'm sure all of you do. But I've had students that told me at the beginning of the course, like, listen, I have a family, I have a job, I'm busy, like this is all the time I have. You know, these these 2 classes I have with you this week, this is my time for English. So I really can't do much outside of class. And you know, that's perfectly fine. Of course, you know, we have to listen to our students and their needs, and you know, just sort of make sure our sort of expectations are sort of in line with the realities of the situation. So obviously, this is I think we can probably all agree it's a good idea to sort of get an idea of our students' needs at the beginning of a course. It's something I always do in my exam preparation courses, to be sure. And one activity that I've done over the years is use questionnaires. I think it's sort of a nice fit for a needs analysis activity. There are, of course, sort of other versions of needs analysis activity, but I think this one works particularly well for my students. And basically what I've done is I've sort of adapted the one that I've been using with my students into a handout for this webinar. So this is actually something that you'll receive in your email with your certificate. And I think they're going to give you some slides from the presentation as well. Just to sort of explain the activity, the idea is that we have a series of questions, essentially, to get students sort of thinking and talking about their strengths and weaknesses, their learning preferences, their expectations, their goals, things like that. It's just the type of information that's useful to have about our students at the beginning of a course. And so you might think of a questionnaire as being sort of something that a student would do individually, and you can do it that way. You could sort of hand it out and students could fill it out individually and give it back to you. However, one thing I've sort of started doing over the years is trying to make it a little bit more communicative. And that's why I've designed this particular activity. So the idea is that students actually do this in groups, or in pairs rather. And so what the students are actually writing down on their paper, it's not about themselves, but about their partner. So it's basically the students are interviewing each other about their sort of strengths and weaknesses and so on and so forth. And I find that, at least in my context, it can be a nice sort of communicative activity, a nice way of starting the course, getting students sort of talking to each other about their past experiences with other exams, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, so the idea is that sort of, you know, the students do the activity, and the teacher is, of course, monitoring the activity, maybe listening in and getting a sort of a general feel for the needs of the group. And then, of course, the teacher would collect them at the end of the activity and sort of take them home and do a bit of analysis of sort of general needs, and then at that point make some decisions about what to focus on when they do sort of start getting into the course material. So this is something you can try. It sounds like many of you are doing needs analysis activities. I'm sure you're probably doing something relatively similar to this, but you could always compare your activity to the one that you'll receive as a handout. So that was my first one, needs analysis. My second tip is related to regular review. So I think review needs no introduction. I think it's something that all of us sort of recognize as being useful, particularly in language teaching, no matter what type of course we're doing. Yeah, I was just sort of curious how often you do review activities in your lessons. Is this something you do sort of every lesson, every week, every month? How often do you review activities in your courses? Martha says every week. Nadia says every lesson. Lada, every week. Yeah, lots of every weeks for sure. Great, that's great to hear. That's great to hear. Students really benefit from review. It's an important thing for us to include. I think we can all agree that. And as I said, I think it's particularly important with language learning in general. And exam preparation course is a definitely a language learning opportunity and situation. You know, our mind, it's kind of designed to forget things when you think about it. So forgetting things is actually just as normal as learning things. And our brain kind of needs to be pushed a little bit to think that something's important enough to kind of move it into our background, into our long-term memory. to really acquire a piece of language and be able to use it fluently. That takes time and sort of repetition. And so one choice that I made a number of years ago was to include review in every single lesson. That's something I've been doing for a long time now. And yeah, I think that just making sure it's sort of just basically, I start my lessons with review. That's when I do it. And I think making it part of my lesson plan, every single lesson plan, I think it's been good for me because it's sort of a good reminder that that's something I always need to be doing. And, always need to be thinking about, sort of trying to come up with things that I think students need to review. And yeah, I just have some sort of tips based on my personal experience trying to include review in all my lessons. By the way, I think at the end of the lesson makes just as much sense as at the beginning, but I've chosen to do it at the beginning. And yeah, sort of over time, I've sort of come up with the way that I normally do it, which is to keep it quite short. I think that if you try to review a little bit too much, it's easy for the review to kind of take over the lesson and sort of take valuable time away from the sort of the main tasks that make up the sort of learning objectives for that day's lesson. And I think one way of keeping it short and sweet is to focus on, just a few words, even just one word, one collocation, or perhaps just one aspect of a grammar point. So for example, if you wanted to review the future perfect, maybe you could focus on just the question forms with the future perfect. You wouldn't have to sort of try to do the whole grammar point in your review section. Maybe just give them some targeted practice with a little bit of it that you had noticed that students were having a little trouble with the first time you taught it. Yeah, so keeping it short, keeping it focused, I think is a good rule of thumb. Another one that I would say is that a review should never feel like a test. Because as I said, sort of forgetting something, it's just as normal and natural as learning something. And we should never make students feel bad about not having learned something the first time or even the second time, because actually that's normal when you're learning another language. It's normal to learn something one week and not remember it the next week. Or maybe it sounds a bit more familiar, but you don't really remember quite how to use it. So I think that when you're thinking about review, I think you should start from the place that you are just assuming that the students have forgotten what you're going to review. And that's a good place to start. And then when they have remembered some of it, then you can sort of congratulate them and say, oh, wow, so we only looked at that once and you guys have really understood it. We don't even need to review this really. Actually, we can just move on to the next part of the lesson. That making students feel good about themselves rather than sort of the opposite of making them feel bad about not remembering something. Because students are sort of apt to do that to themselves, actually. They're apt to say, oh, well, we just studied this last week and I don't remember any of it. But actually, that's normal. That's sort of just part of learning a language. Maybe frustrating, but it's normal. So I've been talking about sort of a little bit of review in each lesson. However, another very useful thing to do is to dedicate a whole lesson to review every once in a while, maybe every month or every unit, sort of however you're teaching your course. And I think a good basis for those are these review sections from the Ready For books. This one comes from the C1 Advanced from Unit 5. And so what we've heard from the markets, what teachers have told us is that these review sections are very popular. Teachers like these, and I can definitely see why. I've of course used these myself over the years, and yeah, I like that they give you some nice focused practice with either the language or the vocabulary from the unit. But one thing I particularly like is that there are always exam tasks that actually integrate some of the grammar or some of the sort of new language or lexis from the unit. So for example, here we have an exam task. It's a part 2, open, close here on the right. But actually within that exercise, they give the students a little bit of review with relative clauses, which was one of the grammar points sort of covered in this unit. So the authors have been very sort of clever about integrating some review into these exam tasks. So students are sort of getting 2 for 1 in that sense. And lastly, one sort of feature of Ready For is that in the review section, there's always a writing. And the authors feel strongly, and I agree, that writing is just an excellent way of reviewing things. Writing related to the topic of the unit is a great way for students to kind of look back at some of the language that they've learned and sort of integrate it in a meaningful way into a piece of writing. That's a great way of helping students really acquire the new language that has sort of come up throughout. So one last one last tip about review is the fact that with the new Ready 4 series, this 4th edition, Macmillan's really taken a big step forward in terms of technology. And so now there is a wide variety of digital components available to teachers and students. So we have, for example, a students app that students can sort of get access to when they buy the students book. And so these are some examples of some of the, by the way, there's sort of screenshots I took with my cell phone. This is what it would look like on a phone. And you can see they're sort of mobile friendly. They're sort of this type of simple activity that you could do very easily on your phone, maybe when you're waiting for the bus or something like that. So it's a nice way of giving students a little bit of extra practice with the language, but also exam tasks. There are also exam tasks that students can do right on their phone. So another nice sort of resource that Macmillan has created. So we talked about needs analysis and regular review. So the next one I'd like to talk about is vocabulary notebooks. So I think that from the beginning of the course, I think it's really nice to do a little bit of learner training, a little bit of sort of pushing students to be a little bit more organized about the way they organize new vocabulary that comes up during the course. Because there's some very good research that indicates that the more organized students are, the higher they achieve, the more they learn. And when you think about that, that's kind of obvious in a way. I think that the more organized you are at doing almost anything, including teaching, you sort of do it better, right? So I'll be giving you some tips that maybe you can give your students about setting up a vocabulary notebook. But first, I actually just wanted to give you a little taste of how vocabulary, how Lexis is approached in the Ready 4 series. So as sort of a typical Ready 4 vocabulary activity, in this case, we're completing a couple sentences with a verb from the box. So I thought we could just do this one together for fun. So for number 1, what verb from the box fits in both A and B? What verb would that be? Could anyone sort of let me know in the chat box? Yes, everybody's saying get. Get. Great. So I have one more for you. This is number 2. So what verb fits into sentence 2A and 2B? Yes, everybody is saying put, which is of course the right answer. So I wanted to demonstrate this one in particular because I think it's pretty representative of how sort of Lexis is treated in the book. So you'll notice that this is a C1 book, but actually this exercise is focusing on get, have, keep, look, put, which are fairly sort of simple verbs, but students are learning some C2 sort of lexical items here. Put a great strain on, for example, or to put someone down. This is the type of language that students still need to acquire at a C1 level. And this basically, the authors, Roy Norris and Amanda French, they've done this for a reason because, well, first of all, for 2 reasons actually. First of all, because this is actually the way that vocabulary is tested on the exam. Every once in a while, you do have Cambridge sort of testing an individual difficult word. That does happen. But more often not, they're actually testing students' knowledge of collocation, of their knowledge of what words sound good together, what combinations of words sort of work and which ones don't. And that's what students are getting here. And you can see how the collocation is always in bold. That's used throughout the book to sort of show students that this is a high frequency item of formulaic language. And the second reason why the authors have chosen to do this is because actually it makes a lot of sense for language learning in general. Sort of memorizing lists of difficult words is, maybe not a bad idea, but in terms of sort of improving your fluency and your accuracy in terms of sort of talking about sort of everyday things, actually it makes a lot more sense to study sort of high frequency chunks of language like this, because if you're able to sort of learn a chunk of language as a whole thing and then sort of reproduce it, that's going to make you more fluent. So you're going to be sort of producing a whole piece of language rather than sort of word by word. And the second reason is also because of accuracy. So when you think about it, you could learn just the phrasal verb to get on with somebody. But if you learn it within a longer phrase, that makes it, you're going to be able to use it more accurately. You're going to be able to use sort of a longer piece of language accurately. And that's going to sort of lead to more accuracy sort of overall in your spoken and also written output when you think about it. So now that we've sort of talked a little bit about how Lexis is sort of presented and practiced throughout the Ready For books, I thought we could just have a look at some tips for how to take this language from the book or language that students find in other places as well, and sort of collect it in an organized way in our notebooks. So the first one is that the main authors of this book would say, and I would agree, that getting students to write down collocations makes a lot of sense. Getting students to record longer pieces of language and not just individual words can definitely help them improve their English for the reasons that we mentioned earlier. And also one thing that I insist on in my classes, or maybe not insist, but I strongly suggest, is that students always include a sample sentence with the word or the lexical item collocation that they record in their notebook. Because when you think about it, an example sentence is a very useful thing. When you look up a word in the dictionary, you get a definition of the word, but you also get example sentences. And I find myself I read the definition, but I immediately look down at those example sentences because they're a very useful way of understanding not only the meaning of a word, but how you actually use it. And if students are writing down a full sentence, with the new lexical item that they're recording in their notebooks, they're giving themselves a good sort of reminder later. So if they come back to it sort of 2 weeks or a month later, they're going to sort of have a nice piece of context there for the language. It's going to help them sort of remember the context for it and remember how to use it and what it means. And the final one is that I think that organizing vocabulary by theme also makes a lot of sense. So I think sort of the normal thing that students do, which is not completely understandable, is they sort of do it by chronological order. So they sort of put the date at the top of the page and they record whatever came up that day in the lesson or whatever the teacher put on the board. And then they sort of move on and they have a new page for the next class, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, students writing down things in class is great. There's nothing wrong with that. But it actually, if you do it that way, things are just kind of all mixed together, and it can make things it can make it actually pretty hard to find something if you're looking for it, if you know what I mean. If you say, oh, I remember this one. This was we talked about this the other lesson, and they're sort of looking through the books, sort of can't find it. However, if they organize their books according to themes, for example, maybe sports or achievements or healthcare or something like that, if they sort of collect their collocations or their words into those categories and they have a nice clear header at the top of the page, that's going to make it a lot easier for students to go back and find that language and review it. We were talking about the importance of review earlier. And it's just going to lead to a much more organized notebook. So other sort of possible things could be maybe parts of the exam. Maybe students would have like a word formation section, possibly. or maybe a section for speaking, maybe some turn-taking type of expressions that they could use in a certain part of the exam. And they could also just have a personal system. I've actually had students have words that start with A or something. It doesn't really matter as long as students sort of have an organized way of recording vocabulary. It's going to make their life easier in terms of sort of reviewing it and sort of actually acquiring that language instead of just it being kind of lost in a mix of notes. So we've talked about setting up a notebook, review, needs analysis. So now we're going to move on to sort of measuring progress. And as I said at the beginning, I'll be sort of focusing on the C1 level because this newly released C1 Advanced book. And at C1 level in particular, I think that sometimes it's hard for students to see their progress. You don't, at a C1 level, even at a B2 level, you don't notice your progress quite as much as you do when you're sort of an A1 or A2. At that level, you're learning such basic things as you can really I can talk about the future now. I couldn't do that before. So you can really see progress at lower levels in a way that you don't see it at higher levels. So I think we have to kind of try to help students see the progress they're making by maybe helping them see that they've done a little bit better on the reading than the one they did earlier, or they've maybe even that vocabulary notebook we've been talking about can be a way of showing students how much they've learned in your course and how much new language they've learned. I think that giving students sort of quizzes or sort of review tests from time to time can also be a good way of showing them progress. That's one thing I wanted to talk about here, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of new digital components to this course. We talked about the Students app before, and there's also a Teachers app with lots of resources. One of those is called the Test Generator. And so if you sort of put in your code when you get your teacher's book and you sort of open the web page and you go to this Test Generator part of the Teachers app, it opens up this sort of system, which is very interesting, actually. So there are sort of tests that have already been created for each unit in the book that you could just sort of print out or download as a PDF and give your students. But Macmillan's sort of taken a step further and sort of allowed you to customize the tests in a very easy way. So basically, they have the test, and then you can just tick boxes for what you want to include. So if you want to make the test a bit shorter, if you feel like it's a bit too long, maybe you only have an hour instead of an hour and a half or something, you can just sort of very easily eliminate maybe one of the exam tasks, or maybe there just wasn't time to do one of the grammar points from the section, or you didn't feel like it was important, maybe the students already know it, and you could just easily take that right off the exam. I know for a fact this is going to save me time because I spent time sort of printing out tests and then sort of cutting them out by hand with a photocopier. I'm sure many of you had the same experience to make my own tests. So Macmillan's made that infinitely easier for us. And you can actually save the tests that you make as well in this My Saved Text section. And so, so I think giving students sort of regular tests, as long as you're sort of thinking about it as sort of formative assessment, as sort of checking in with their needs, sort of seeing how they're doing in terms of making progress with those weaknesses that you've identified in your needs analysis. However, I think that within the context of exam preparation, we also need to be thinking about mock exams. And those should feel a lot different than this type of unit test type of thing that we've been talking about. A mock exam should really resemble the real exam to the extent which is possible within a classroom. Because on the exam day, we don't want students to be surprised by anything. We want to be able to sort of help them see how it's going to be on the real exam to the extent it's possible, as I mentioned. So I'm just sort of curious just to get started. How often do you give your students mock exams? Because I know this depends a lot sort of on teaching context. Eva's saying that she can't hear me very well. Eva, I actually have a pretty good microphone. I don't know if you can see this. I don't know what's going on. I can sort of try to turn the volume up a little bit. Eva, can you hear me better now? How is my audio for everybody else? Can you hear me okay? It's kind of important that you can hear me well. Okay, so other people are saying sort of loud and clear. Okay, so good, that makes me feel a little bit better. Right, we were talking about how often you give mock exams. So let me just go back up here to your answers to those questions. So Lada was saying 1 or 2 times. Andrea was saying once. Slovada, 3 or 4 times. Once a semester. Yeah, so I find that this, when I've asked teachers this question, I find I sort of get quite a lot of different answers. I know that in certain teaching contexts, some students really insist on having mock exams all the time. And there's their sort of idea of exam preparation is just doing a bunch of exams. But I would sort of, I would push against that if I were you, if you can, because I think that in an exam preparation course, we really need to be helping students develop the skills and the language that are actually tested on the exam. Because if we're just giving them a bunch of mock exams, we're sort of giving them a test that they either sort of pass or fail each time. And they may be getting better at sort of exam strategies and time management, things like that. But I'm not sure how much better they're getting at the skills that are tested on the exam. And really the best way to do well on this exam or any really high stakes exam is to really have the skills and the language that are tested on the exam. And so in my particular context, I do it twice during the course, once in the middle and once at the end. Doing a bit more than that is fine, but I would try to push back against students that want to do them, for example, in every class. And that's sort of not the idea of the Ready For series, actually, when you think about it, because the Ready For series is all about integrating sort of a general English with an exam preparation course to sort of not only train students with the exam, but give them the actual, help them develop the skills and the language that they need to pass the exam. So, but that said, we should be giving our students mock exams where they sit down and do an official exam for sure. And as I said, I think that making sure that making sure that mock exam kind of feels as authentic as possible, I think has a lot of benefits. So for example, one thing I would suggest doing is using sample mark sheets. So you can easily download these from that teacher's resource center, sort of teacher's app that I mentioned earlier. And doing entire papers too. So having students sit down and do a full listening paper, I think makes a lot of sense. Because listening for 20 minutes is not quite the same as listening for 40 minutes. You know, it's a bit of a marathon. Students sort of need to get used to that experience of having to do 40 minutes of listening. And that there are sort of 2 full mock exams or practice tests on that teacher's app that I mentioned earlier that you can use in your lessons. And so keeping to official timing as well, I think is really important, particularly for writing, getting students to sort of be able to produce the type of writing that they really, that they're going to be expected to do on the exam within the time that they're actually given. Because, you know, having an hour and a half to write an essay is nice, but you don't have that much time on this exam. You know, you only have 45 minutes, and so it's important to be able to produce a good piece of writing within that time. And finally, so we've talked about mock exams as sort of an exam and in the most sort of authentic sense possible. But afterwards, I think that mock exams can be a learning experience as well. I think it's a nice time to sort of check in with the needs that we sort of been identifying in our needs analysis and other activities. So I think that's one sort of nice reflection activity is to get students to think about sort of what parts of the exam they did well in and which parts of the exam they still need to improve on. And you know, it might seem like an obvious activity, but I think that sort of getting it all down on paper, sort of in an organized way, I think it can help students sort of see clearly where their weaknesses are and where they still need to improve. So this is basically what I do with my students. We create this sort of table in our notebooks, and then we put the exam tasks, each one from each paper, into either the ready section, which is sort of, good, and then the almost ready, which is sort of parts of the exam we still need to get better at. And yeah, for me, a ready, if students are ready for part one, for example, that means they're getting sort of above 70%. They're really doing well in that part. And almost ready would be sort of like below 60%. Maybe students, still struggling with that part of the exam with some of the skills or language that's tested there. And also, when you do a mock exam and when you mark them yourself, it's very useful to create this type of table, but for the whole class. So you're getting sort of a global feel for sort of where your students' strengths and weaknesses are, because again, that's sort of a nice way of revisiting some of those needs that you had identified earlier, hopefully, in your needs analysis, and being able to sort of focus your attention on the aspects of the test that your students still need more help with. And not spending a lot of time on something they're already good at, because that time could sort of be reallocated and used more productively. So that's mock exams. So my next tip is about accuracy. So one of the sort of maybe not great things about these exams is they definitely reward accuracy more than, for example, fluency. I mean, we may not agree with that, but that's sort of how these tests are constructed. Accuracy is just very important on this type of exam. And and I think that's particularly true for C1, and that's why I wanted to talk about it today, because I think in a C1 preparation course, focusing on accuracy is important, which is something I sort of want to demonstrate now with this activity. So I've taken 3 descriptors from the CFR, the Common European Framework of Reference, related to a category called language control. This is basically accuracy in terms of lexis or vocabulary. And one of these is C1. One of them describes a C1 speaker of English. So I want you to tell me which one you think it is. Does 1, 2, or 3 describe a C1 level? A C1 level speaker of English in terms of vocabulary control. So just let me know in the chat. So not ask me to repeat the question. So basically we're looking at these descriptors and we want to decide which one describes a C1 level. So I'm going to show the answer now. So as many of you correctly identified, it's the middle one. So the one on the left here, on my left, is B1. So there's some type of vocabulary that's actually hindering communication, stopping somebody from understanding. But at B2, sort of on the right over here, we're starting to be able to express sort of more complex ideas, but we're still making errors with more complex language. However, you notice over there, they're not talking a lot about using sort of vocabulary that's going to stop you from understanding somebody. And whereas at C1, there's an even bigger jump. At B2, you can basically, B2 student is very, very good at the language, is able to communicate their ideas and their thoughts and able to sort of participate in conversations and everything. However, they're doing that with quite a degree of inaccuracy. That inaccuracy sort of not getting in the way too much in terms of communicating. But at a C1 level, the bar is much higher. If you look at this, it says occasional minor slips, but no significant vocabulary errors, which means that a C1 speaker, at least in terms of language control, sort of vocabulary control, is a speaker who's not making a lot of mistakes. Is making sort of small mistakes, maybe with articles or maybe the preposition that doesn't sound quite right, that kind of sort of smaller error. But there's not sort of big noticeable errors. There's no errors that are making it hard to understand the person, sort of like using completely the wrong words. So I think we can all agree that that's a pretty high bar to reach, actually, for many students, a C1 level. A C1 level is a very, very high level in a language. And it requires accuracy. There's just a very high degree of accuracy here. And so the sort of the big question is sort of how do students get there? How can they reach that level of accuracy? So I think that one kind of easy answer is sort of the amount of exposure they have to sort of natural, correct language. So if students are reading a lot, if they're watching TV shows, if they're listening to the teacher, et cetera, they're going to be sort of exposed to so much correct and natural language that they're going to start sort of using it naturally themselves. However, I think we can all agree that there are just a lot of things that students are never going to kind of notice on their own. They're going to need help with. And I think in terms of when we're talking about accuracy, I think one of the greatest tools for helping students improve their accuracy is the teacher. There's just things that the teacher can do that a course book or a TV show or whatever it is just never going to be able to do. And that is specifically is giving our students feedback on the language that they sort of produce in class. Letting them know sort of what language they're using well and what language they could be using better. So I just wanted to share with you sort of a personal system of mine, which is basically every time the students are talking in class, I have my notebook open and I'm taking notes. That's sort of what I do in class. I definitely sort of correct things on the spot for sure if I feel like it's a significant error. But for more sort of subtle errors and things like that, I just write them down. And then I just put them up on the board basically after the activity. And I elicit the mistakes, sort of elicit what's wrong and sort of try to get students to give me a better, more natural sounding way of expressing that idea. And of course, if they can't give me that, then I provide it to make sure that they sort of have it. And then, hopefully that's going into their notebooks and their awareness has been raised about, a lot of saying advices. Yes, yeah, I get that a lot. That's a hard mistake actually, because in a lot of languages, in Spanish and Italian at least, those are countable. That's a countable noun, but of course it's uncountable in English. But I think just as importantly, I also write down good things. I actually think it's relatively easy to listen closely enough to write down mistakes. I think it's actually harder and possibly more important to listen enough to hear good things too. And writing down sort of good things that your students said, I think has a lot of benefits because number one, students might actually not know that what they said was good and correct. And if you put it up on the board and say, this was a nice piece of language I heard a student say, they know that what they said was right and they'll use it again. And also it provides a learning experience, a learning opportunity for the other students in the group who may not know that particular piece of vocabulary. Also, I'll of course focus on pronunciation as well. That's another sort of category. So I sort of collect pronunciation mistakes, but also sometimes sort of really nice sounding, maybe intonation or something that I thought was sort of well used in a particular context. Again, sort of focusing on the good as well. I think that's an important part of giving students feedback. So I'm sure many of you are doing some version of this. Is my own kind of idiosyncratic way of recording language. But if you don't have sort of a notebook in your hand when your students are talking, I would really encourage you to try. This is something I started to do during the Delta when I was doing that course. And I feel like it kind of sort of transformed my teaching in a way because it sort of made me much more aware of what was going on in terms of the language that my students were producing and helping students with their specific needs, if that makes sense, and sort of being more aware of their needs. Let me just try to find my. So looks like Vladimir is doing something similar: grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, communication, achievement. Yeah, I mean, that system makes just as much sense as mine. That sounds like a great way of doing it. Yeah, I guess for me, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between what's grammar and what's vocabulary at an advanced level because oftentimes what I'm writing down is kind of like almost half a sentence or something. So I think it might be hard for me to sometimes divide those two. However, I think that system, that's a good one. I like that you have communication achievement as one of your things, Vladimir. That's very interesting. I'd like to see a page from you. The last one I want to focus on is pronunciation. So we had just talked about pronunciation actually just now as being something to look out for. And I think that perhaps sometimes pronunciation, I'm sure this isn't true for you teachers, but at least for some teachers, I think that it's something that sort of maybe is seen as like an extra thing, maybe something to add to a lesson, um, maybe something that sort of gets overlooked or skipped if there isn't enough time, which I think is unfortunate because actually for exam preparation and for language learning more generally, it's actually very important. Just to illustrate that, these are the speaking assessment criteria from the Cambridge Advanced Exam. And there are 5 categories that speaking examiners listen for when they're listening to candidates during the speaking test. I'm a Cambridge examiner for C1. And yeah, when I'm listening to students, I'm listening for grammar, I'm listening for lexis, but I'm definitely listening for pronunciation as well. And actually the mark that I give candidates for pronunciation is actually worth just as much as the mark that I give them for grammar. So when we're thinking about improving students' speaking, at least for this particular exam, improving a student's pronunciation is just as important as improving their grammar in terms of their speaking mark. So if you're not sort of including pronunciation at all in your lessons, I would really encourage you to try to encourage at least a little bit. A little bit can go a long way actually with pronunciation. I think just listening for pronunciation mistakes and writing them down in your notebook when you hear them, and then putting them up on the board and making students sort of aware of a clearer, more internationally intelligible sort of version of that, of the pronunciation of that word, is going to help students, because if we never sort of correct them, their pronunciation mistakes, then they aren't aware of them, and they'll just continue sort of pronouncing things that way on the official exam that they take, and of course not earn sort of as high marks as they could otherwise. So just to give you a sort of taste of the ready for pronunciation sections, so there's a pronunciation section at the end of each unit of the book in the 4th edition, which I think is a great addition to this series. And basically, I just wanted to illustrate sort of what they look like. So this one's taken from, I think it's unit 5. And this one focuses on word stress, which is actually one of the things that's specifically mentioned in the sort of Cambridge assessment for pronunciation. They talk about sentence stress, word stress, intonation, and the pronunciation of individual sounds. Those are sort of what an examiner is supposed to focus on. And this is, it starts with sort of a nice sort of simple awareness raising activity focused on word stress. So we're sort of looking at how some words, at least, when they change form, they actually change word stress as well. So for example, for number 1, it's impossible to motivate others when you have no motivation yourself. You can see how sort of the word stress moves a little bit. And that's, of course, the same is true for recognize and recognition. So I don't know about you, but this is exactly the type of pronunciation error that I correct in my C1 classes. This is very familiar to me. And the students just aren't always aware of it. And so getting some nice focus practice on it here in the book is great to see. And yeah, so they do this sort of awareness raising, awareness raising activity. And then they look at some rules. Of course, there are some rules you can learn from this type of moving word stress. And then they finish with a nice sort of communicative activity where they're doing a nice game here. So they're sort of making, as you can see, there's sort of these pronunciation sections are making pronunciation teaching, relatively easy, relatively sort of fun within the context of what is demanded on the exam. And yeah, so I would definitely encourage you, if you do use this this course in the future, to take full advantage of these pronunciation sections. As I said, if we're talking about speaking in particular, they are actually as important as the grammar sections in the book. So Nadia is saying, yes, I agree. I think Nadia, often students, they learn words sort of in print, and because they haven't actually heard them out loud, they actually don't know, they may know the word, but they don't actually know how to pronounce. I think that's actually very, very common. And Yeah, and they might actually just kind of associate, they may actually put the word stress sort of where they would naturally put it in their first language. I think that's at least true of Spanish learners. Yeah, so yeah, helping students notice that kind of thing. And as I said, with pronunciation, a little bit goes a long way, I think. So yeah, we can sort of finish there. Those were my 7 tips for exam preparation classes, sort of best practices to think about right at the beginning. We had needs analysis, regular review, the vocabulary notebook, monitoring progress, mock exams, a focus on accuracy and also pronunciation. In the chat box, I just wanted to finish by asking you what activities or what ideas from this webinar do you think you're going to sort of put into practice, so you thought were sort of interesting enough to maybe to try out? So you just let me know in the chat box. What things did you like? Which you think might be interesting? A lot of like the vocabulary notebook. Yeah, they liked praising. Yeah, so praising good language. I think that's it creates a nice classroom atmosphere too. It's sort of nice to know that your teacher's listening for good things, not just mistakes. Pierre, Kristen liked the monitoring progress. Martha says she's going to use that chart with the sort of ready, almost ready. Yeah, I've used that in a lot of different courses, and I think it sort of adds a little bit of clarity to their results in a sense. Victoria liked the mock exam bit. A lot of people are saying vocabulary notebook. That's great. That's great. I think just getting students, even if they don't implement all of the tips that I gave them, but even just getting them to be a little bit more organized with their notebooks, I think, again, a little bit can go a long way, or at least valuing organization within their notebooks, I think. Okay, it's really great to see that so many of you got something useful out of this webinar. That makes me feel very good. And yeah, I just want to say best of luck with your exam preparation courses. So if Juan, if you want to come back on, maybe there were some questions in that question and answer box that maybe we can have a quick chat about.
Hi. Well, first, I want to say thank you very much so far. It's been great. And we don't have questions in the questions chat, but we do have questions from Facebook. Hello, Facebook people. Thank you for joining us. We have 2 questions here. One from Mohamed Abed. What are some of the main needs analysis limitations, mainly in online teaching?
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by needs analysis and limitations. Maybe the limitations to needs analysis within that context, is that probably what you mean?
Yeah, I think that's probably what they mean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this activity that I designed, I've done in breakout rooms. Of course, you could just sort of put students into pairs and have them fill it out. Obviously, getting the worksheet back to you might be slightly more complicated. But if you were using, for example, a shared document, it could be sort of writing into the shared document and getting that back to you. But in terms of sort of limitations, I teach a lot online, and I don't think I see that many, in the sense that getting a sense for students' strengths and weaknesses or their learning preferences, I think that's something that can be done relatively easily online. I mean, another thing to ask students about is sort of how good their internet connection is, because that's sometimes an issue in online teaching. So yeah, knowing things like that can actually be pretty useful at the beginning of an online course, for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. And I agree, I've done a lot of online teaching and usually, works pretty fine.
Yeah.
The second question from Facebook from Innocent Dayang is, how do we clearly differentiate between collocations and idioms?
So interestingly, the word collocation is kind of a flexible term. So I think a lot of times teachers or teacher trainers, they use the word collocation just to mean 2 words that have sort of a strong relationship. But actually, if you kind of read sort of more academic literature about what they call formulaic language, usually, the sort of formulaic language and collocation are used interchangeably. So collocation can actually include the idea of phrasal verbs, it can include the idea of idioms, it can include the idea of lexical phrases. You can make distinctions. So for example, an idiom would be sort of a combination of words where the literal meaning of the words sort of is different than the intended meaning. So for example, a piece of cake, you're not talking about a physical piece of cake, you're talking about something being easy. That would be an idiom. And of course, you could differentiate that with, for example, a lexical phrase, which is just sort of words that just co-occur very frequently in the language. But for me, I think those distinctions aren't very useful, actually, for students, and I'm not sure how useful they are for teachers anyway. I think just thinking about sort of this idea of sort of groups of words that sound good together, that are often used together, I think that's really the key. And whether it's an idiom or a lexical phrase or what they call polywords, like all of the time, that kind of thing, I'm not sure is entirely useful for most teachers and certainly not for students.
All right. Thank you, Larry. And then we have one question here in the chat from Raeza. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's quite long, so I'm going to shorten it. How can you prepare a student for an international exam if they're not at the level?
I mean, this is a common problem, actually. This happens at my school. I do level testing at my school, and sometimes I get students that come in and say, I need a C1, I need a C1 certificate, and I need it now. I need it next month. And they're at a B2 level. And sometimes you have to just be honest with students and because students don't, maybe they just, haven't been in a language classroom for a while. They don't sort of understand quite how much of a gap there is, as we saw with the vocabulary control descriptors, how much of a big gap there is between B2 and C1, and just how much language you have to acquire in order to get there, and how the gains that you have to make in terms of fluency and accuracy, etc. So I think the answer is you can't prepare students for an exam that they're just not good enough for. The best way to pass a C1 advanced exam is to have a C1 level of English. That's got to be, or at least almost. I think, for example, if you're doing you're using this Ready For book, you could go from being sort of a high B2. So you're still a B2 at the beginning, but by the end of the book, you will be a C1 if you've done all the work. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that we can't have students taking exams that they're just not ready for. And sometimes we have to be honest with students about that. Sometimes that can be a difficult conversation to have. But
yes, I totally agree. And I think we have a last question here. Somebody, Susanna, is mentioning that she's not a native speaker, but has to prepare students for the C1 level. And sometimes they struggle with the pronunciation because they have a British textbook and American lecturers. Whether we can give her some advice.
Yeah. So my advice is not to worry too much about the distinctions between British and American English in terms of pronunciation, because actually that doesn't matter to Cambridge at all. I don't know if that's true of the school leaving exam that you're referring to in particular. Yeah, some teachers sort of get a little bit worried about students kind of mixing British English and American English with the pronunciations. But in terms of an exam like Cambridge or IELTS or Trinity, I'm an examiner for all those exams. It doesn't matter if you're mixing those pronunciations. In terms of, when you think about it, in terms of actually learning the language, most of the time, students are probably not going to be speaking to an American or British person anyway. So actually, the most important thing is what's called intelligibility, and that's what they put on the Cambridge exams. Like for C1, and it's also true of the Common European Framework of Reference, at a C1 level, you're always intelligible. That's what they say. So there's basically no time where you're making it difficult for the person to listen to you. That doesn't mean you don't have an accent. You can be perfectly intelligible and have an accent. Accents are sort of normal and fine. Yeah, in terms of whether you yourself possess sort of a high enough level of pronunciation, and nowadays, we don't really talk about students sort of imitating American or British accents. So your accent is probably perfect for your students. If your students are learning your pronunciation, that's going to be good enough, because their goal should be sort of international intelligibility, not sort of sounding like a native speaker. unless they're planning to move to the United States and live there for the rest of their life, in which case maybe that would be something they would want to do. But I think that really the goal for language learning should be intelligibility, not sort of a native-like accent, at least in my opinion.
All right, thank you very much. If I think I can add one thing there, it's always important if you're preparing for any exam to make sure that you know how it's going to be evaluated so that you can help the students.
Absolutely, absolutely. And knowing that kind of thing can avoid, maybe telling something that's not correct, like, oh, they have to use British English because it's a Cambridge exam, but that's actually not true. I have students that come into my exams with, beautiful Irish accents and stuff because they've lived in Ireland for a while or something. And that's just fine. Or beautiful Spanish accents as well. The accent just is not that important.
All right. Well, we have like one question that Barbara just wrote, but I think we just answered that. Whether there's a problem mixing British and American spelling, vocabulary, pronunciation, and I think we just covered it, right?
Basically, yeah. And also, it's a fair point to make that in the writing, it also doesn't matter about spelling. There's sort of like a footnote in the handbook for teachers saying that they prefer students are sort of consistent. So if they're consistently spelling something the American way. So as if they're not sort of going back and forth. However, it's like a footnote, and I think it's probably the last thing that teachers should be worried about in terms of how the marking, how the examiners mark the exam. They're much more interested in organization, much more interested in whether the student has sort of fulfilled the communicative purpose of the. If they're thinking about spelling, I don't think they're thinking about it very much.
All right. Thank you. And I think this is now definitely the last one here in the Q&A. Mortis just wrote one. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I want you to have a chance to give an answer. Do you think that repeating the same mock exam is a good way for preparing students for the main exam?
No, I don't think so. I think that using the mock exam as a learning opportunity, so for example, they do the mock exam and then in class you go through each of the tasks and try to identify why the students got some of them wrong and was it a vocabulary issue? Was it that they didn't read the question carefully enough? That can be very useful. However, sitting down and taking the same exam again, I'm skeptical about it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Those were all the questions so far. These were excellent tips. I was very, very glad to hear about the notebook, which is something that is not usually found in a lot of textbooks. The idea is having a vocabulary notebook, but the learning to learn skills for students are very, very important, especially adults who haven't learned in a while, maybe. So thank you very much. Ethan, I hope we will find you again soon in another webinar. And if not, we're going to be using the book and preparing our students for both the B2 First and C1 Advanced.
Thanks, Juan, and thanks to everybody for all your participation. Really appreciate all the comments in the chat box and everything. It's great to have such an active audience. That makes webinars a lot more fun to be part of. So thank you, everybody.
Now, please remember that if you loved this webinar as much as I did, and you want to use some of these tips, you can do them, of course, in your classes, but you can also do them here with our material, the Ready for B2 First and Ready for C1 Advanced. These are new editions that have just come out, and will give you all the help that you need for your exam preparation courses. So thank you. Do check them out down here, macmillanenglish.com/ready4-4E. This is the 4th edition.